What's my motivation? Jesus has made a great difference in my life. I honestly can say I don't think I'd still be married or would have even been marriageable if it wasn't for Jesus in the first place. He really has changed my life. In Jesus' words, we're to love the Lord our God with all our soul, with all our mind, with all our heart and with all our strength. And seriously, it's about helping people to seriously engage their minds about just a few topics each time. I do hope that these topics really do inspire people to love him more. How long is a day in Genesis is what this talk is all about. Who cares and so what? So it's a reasonable topic. You know, a lot of people think, well, evolution is a fact. Why are you interested in even debating this topic? What's evolution got to do with your beliefs and the way you run your life? So a guy called William Praveen. So he was a professor. He unfortunately died in 2015 from a brain tumour. Professor Praveen won a David L. Hole Prize from the International Society of Science, Philosophy and the Study of Biology. Roughly that sort of a name in 2011, just before he died. And this is what he wrote. He said, the modern evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear that there are no gods, there is no purpose, there is no ultimate foundation to ethics, there is no ultimate meaning to life, there is no life after death, and there is no free will either. You thought you chose your red shirt to come here tonight by your free will? I'm afraid he would disagree. He believes that there is nothing else but stuff. And stuff is, of course, chemistry and atoms, and it's moved by physics, and there's no room in that space for you to think or to exercise free will because you don't have one. So when you read that, this is what someone tells you about what the biology is actually teaching. You're realising that biology is teaching stuff about the way to view life and the way to live your life. They're not two separate compartments. Professor Richard Dawkins, who was mentioned before, he's at the University of Oxford. He was the professor there of their public understanding of science for more than 10 years. Praveen, by the way, was at the University of Cornell. And Dawkins said this, he said, I'm a passionate Darwinian, so a passionate follower of Charles Darwin evolution ideas, when it comes to science, to explaining the world. But I'm a passionate anti-Darwinian when it comes to morality and politics. So he doesn't like the idea that politics and morality should be driven by the facts of evolution. He wants you to have a split brain. And so once again, it just helps people to realise that evolutionary biology is not just a little compartment on one side. As one very famous Professor Michael Roos said, evolution is a religion. It was true of evolution today, it was true of evolution from the beginning, and he's very proud to say he's not a Christian. Whereas Genesis tells us a very different story, doesn't it, to that bleakish view, a lot of people call it bleak, about evolutionary determinism. Genesis would say what we are, it says what our purpose is. It actually says we have a purpose for a start. What's our value? What's our future? What is marriage? Why is there death and suffering? Why is there death and suffering? Why did Jesus die? This is why this topic is so foundational and so fundamental to us as Christians. It's not a side topic. It undergirds everything. Some Christians, not all, read the Bible to understand that when it talks about 6 days, it means 6 sort of 24-hour days. Other Christians, of course, say when they read their Bible and they read in Genesis that it was made in 6 days, they tend to think that those days might represent eras or ages of millions of years. Christians that believe that the day mentioned in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 to 2, verse 3, that section all about the 6 days of creation and the God of rest, Christians that believe that that's a day only do so for a number of reasons. For example, if the world was made in 6 days, then that's very different to the teaching from evolution, which says that actually it was made over many millions of years before it was reached anywhere near its completion. So 14,000 million years ago was when the universe came into being, supposedly. 4,500 million years ago was when Earth came into being. 700 million years ago was when land plants came to being. Humans of some sort, some description, only came on the scene very recently, things that you wouldn't even call human, but vaguely like that. 6 million years ago, they would say. So the time course to create in an evolutionary scheme is many millions of years compared to the 6 days it says in the Bible. So they're out of step. Christians who believe that a day in Genesis is like a solar day would also point to Mark chapter 10, verse 6 to 8, where Jesus is talking to some Pharisees about the divorce question. And he says to them, haven't you read that in the beginning God made them male and female? Well, obviously Jesus would be very wrong if the world had actually evolved into being, because it was nowhere near the beginning that God made them male and female. It was thousands of millions of years later before there was any male and female humans around. So Christians would say that this is another reason for why they would believe that the days in Genesis are 24 hours. Another reason is that if the world took many millions of years to come into being, and remember there was land plants 700 million years ago and people only came around the last few million years, or creatures like people, then that meant that if God used that method, that he intended that there would be a lot of suffering. Because evolution involves, of course, of organisms, a lot of death and killing. We find fossils riddled with cancer. So there wasn't just death and killing, there was also nasty diseases going on. So Christians sometimes wonder, well, if God could have just made the world in 6 days, but didn't, but used this method, then that meant that he intended to have a lot of suffering in a system which was otherwise avoidable. And a lot of Christians find that hard to square up with their ideas of what God is actually like. But not all Christians, but a lot of Christians have trouble reconciling that. In the Christian view, death is something that came about because of a decision by two people. That humans didn't have death before that. The vast majority of what we call living, breathing animals didn't. In the Christian scheme of things, we believe that death will one day be no more. But of course, in an evolutionary belief system, death will always be with us. It's a part of the way things will keep on evolving. So we read in the Bible, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 26, that death is a final enemy. We look forward as Christians to a time in the future when there will be no death. If you think about an incident involving Jesus, he had this great friend, Lazarus, who died. Now, Jesus resurrected Lazarus, didn't he? He brought him back to life, even though Lazarus was a stinking corpse. But do you remember that just before he did that, what was his emotional state? He was crying. Why would you cry over someone that died if you knew you were just about to bring them back to life? I posit that the reason why he was crying is because death is so foreign. It is a horrible invading entity or situation that we have in our world that was never meant to have been there in the first place. Christians who believe that the day in Genesis, it was a solar day, would also say, well, if it wasn't, then that means when there finally was an Adam and Eve, and they were in the garden, and God was calling it very good, that it wasn't really very good. Because that Garden of Eden was built on millions of years of death and suffering. So how could that be called very good by God? Especially when later on he says, compared to that very good, he then curses the world. And how does he curse Adam and Eve? There's painful toil. There's death. There's pain in childbirth. So these are other reasons why some Christians believe that it doesn't sit easy for them to try to reconcile the Bible in its totality with the idea that the 6 days of Genesis weren't just 24-hour days. This one's from Acts chapter 3, verse 21. It's a verse in the New Testament where it talks about how as Christians we look forward to, and actually uses the word, restoration of all things. Now, if we came from Adam and Eve in a perfect garden and the world was perfect and there was no disease and suffering, frankly, I'm really looking forward to the world being restored to that state. I'm not so keen for the world to be restored back to the way it was, if the way it was is just basically the same as the way it is now, just without machine guns and nuclear weapons and those sort of things. So these are some of the reasons. But despite all that, we still need to grapple with, well, what's the text trying to say? Now, in a previous year, we looked at, in seriously, the type of literature Genesis is. And we talked at great length about how it's not poetry, it's not saga, it's not myth, it's trustworthy history, to take a quote from Edward J. Yawm, a great Hebrew professor. And we gave a lot of reasons from the Hebrew language itself why it is that we can know for certain that Genesis is not poetic, it's not just trying to give you some ideas, and Genesis is not a polemic, it's not just an argument. So, but even any piece of literature, no matter what genre, still has words that involve a range of meanings. And that's what we're going to look at in this session. So the word for day that's used in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 to 2, verse 3, and elsewhere in the Bible, is Yawm. You'll often see it pronounced Yawm, and that's probably the correct pronunciation, but I'm going to say Yawm because it's a lot easier. Anyone here know Hebrews? No, does anyone speak Hebrew, I should say? Has anyone got any Hebrew friends or Israeli friends that they listen to? Yeah, okay. I mean, with the internet you can look it up, but Yawm's got that ring to it, you know, how long is a Yawm? So Yawm does have a range of meanings. We call this a semantic field. And as you can see, it can mean the daylight part of a day. It can mean the daylight part plus the night light, or the daytime, the light part and the night part, making up a day, so 24 hours. It can mean a time. It can mean a year, apparently used about 40 times that way, and can mean a season. So how do we know? Is there some ways in which we can know what the Bible expects us to understand that word to mean? Is there some ways to know that? So I thought we'd look at some friendly and unfriendly experts. We've done this before with the previous talk. What do they say? Because I'm not an expert in Hebrew, but I am a communicator, I believe, and I love doing research. So this is a guy called James Barr. So he was an Oxford Regius professor of Hebrew, and he said that to him it's obvious that the writers of Hebrew wrote it such that the reader would understand that the world was created in 6 24-hour days. To him, that is obvious from the text. He doesn't believe this at all, but he does believe that's what the text is trying to say, and he has no doubt in the mind. He's very strong about it in a letter he wrote in 1984. Contrast that, there are a bunch of Hebrew experts who we call friendly witnesses. They do believe that God created the world 24-hour periods of six 24-hour periods, and they are also professors of Hebrew. They do exist. And so just like Bill was talking about, I've got a few mentioned there, Mark John Paul, we've got an Andrew Steinman, we've got a Peter Sibesma from different countries, Rob McCabe. He's a really nice guy. I email him and he answers my questions. He's written some really good articles as well. He's very generous with his time. He's just retired. And Stephen Boyd, who's written a really brilliant PhD on understanding the type of genre letters Genesis is. Rob McCabe was also telling me that there are these other ways in which you can know what the experts are thinking. So it's in the form of lexicons. So lexicons are like dictionaries on steroid. You know, one lexicon has 3 pages devoted to one little particle. You know, like, 3 pages. They're more than dictionaries, much, much more than dictionaries. And some of you have been to Malyon, you would have come across at least probably the first one, the Hebrew and English lexicon of the Old Testament, written by Brown, Drivers and Biggs. There's a Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon. coming down a level, if you like, in terms of complexity or scope is a normal dictionary, a theological dictionary of the Old Testament. And Rob McCabe was saying all of these, when they talk about the different ways in which Yawm can be understood, when they're explaining that Yawm means a 24-hour period, guess which examples they give? They all give the examples from Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 to verse 3. One of Bill's family members kindly donated some time and to help me with some research, and I said, can you look up some English versions and tell me if any of them translate the word day in Genesis 1 verse 1 on any other word apart from the word day. Now, 16 versions they checked, and I checked a few more and separate to that, so I must have gone through at least 20 versions. All of them use the word day there, yet these versions, I know, will use a different word for day in a different place in the Bible. So all of them, all their translators and their translator committees are all quite adamant that the right word to use there is not time or season or generation or aeon, it is day, even though they use some of those other ranges of meaning elsewhere.